I ran into the house and slammed the door behind me. Looking around frantically, I called for my parents. At that moment, I became about 4 years old again. My fear congealed in my guts when I realized they weren't home. They were gone, out of town, wouldn't be back until tomorrow night. That's why I'd been staying at Billy's in the first place. That's why Billy was thump, thump, thump. "Open up, Johnny, I know you're in there," said a slurry voice, sing-songing the words as the owner tried to bowl the door down. I turned and shot the bolt before backing away from the front door as though it might bite me. The wood on the thick old door, solid enough to rattle the windows when it slammed, looked like it was bowing in as whatever was on the other side pushed at the wood. The door warped and twisted and suddenly seemed made of clear film as handprints imposed their image into it. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. My dad had said that door was a foot thick when he installed it, and now it was bending and warping like melted wax. It was too much. I ran into the kitchen and slammed the door. I threw a chair in front of it too, for good measure. After I was certain that I had jammed it in there good, I backed away slowly with wide, staring eyes. I jumped suddenly and shrieked like a tea kettle when my jeans-clad bottom came into contact with something solid. I felt stupid when I realized it was just the fridge. Even laughed a little, thinking maybe I'd exaggerated this whole thing. That's when I heard a terrible cracking sound coming from the living room. It was the sound of wood splintering as its dimensions are violated. He'd be through soon. He'd be through, and he'd have me. Patches would be through. Billy, Randall, Scotty, and I had been friends since we were young. We'd been inseparable, thick as thieves, and the terrors of our neighborhood since we were old enough to walk. Don't get me wrong or anything, we weren't bullies. We weren't bad boys. We had our vegetables. We were in before the streetlights came on. We kept our grades up. We were polite to anyone that we met. The problem was that we liked to play pranks. What child doesn't like to pull a prank now and then? Attack on a teacher's chair, a whoopee cushion on a classmate's seat, a frog in a backpack. We'd done them all, and it had given us a bit of a reputation as troublemakers. When school ended for the summer, and the four of us moved on to middle school, I'm pretty sure the teachers at our old elementary school threw a party to celebrate. We were all just looking forward to summer, a summer of pranks and mischief, but none of us could have foreseen what was to come. After 3 weeks of no school, limited parental supervision, and way too much free time on our hands, we started to get bored. We'd pulled some pranks. Putting mud in Miss Laverne's washing machine had almost gotten us caught, but most people were already wary of us because of our reputation as pranksters, so it was getting hard to pull a really good prank like we wanted. One afternoon, though, the four of us put our heads together and thought of all the people we hadn't pranked yet. And only one person in town came to mind. Patches. The front door crashed open like it had been shot with a cannon, but in the wake of the break-in, I was treated to nothing but a long silence from the living room. No footsteps headed towards the kitchen, no slurry voice trying to call me out. Just a long, uncomfortable silence as I sat with my back against the solid old refrigerator and waited to see what would happen. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, and when I got to 100, I worked my way up to my feet and took a hesitant step towards the kitchen door. That's when the knob started to turn frantically. It turned left, then right, then left again, and someone pushed against it and swore loudly when the chair stopped it from opening. He slammed against the lame barricade, and I saw one of his bloodshot eyes peek through the crack as it trained onto me. The eye went wide in mirth, and I heard the slurry voice call my name again. He rattled at the door a few more times before opening it as far as he could so I could hear him. "Johnny, Johnny, 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 don't you want to see what you did to your old pal Patches? Don't you want to see what you and your friends did to me? Maybe when I'm through this door," he slammed his weight against it again, "I'll give you a taste of what I gave the others. Billy squealed like a little girl when I twisted his fat head right off his shoulders." He screamed through the door as he put his whole weight into the hit, and the legs of the chair started bucking as it got ready to give. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I tore up the stairs as fast as I could, taking the little staircase in the kitchen. Just as my feet touched the bottom step, I heard the door crash open, and I put on a burst of speed. As I hit the halfway point, something grabbed my ankle, and I fell hard onto the rough wooden steps. I bit my tongue on the way down, and felt my lips split as I hit the stairs. One look at what stood at the bottom, though, and both of those pains were nothing. His hand was wrapped in the same threadbare mittens he'd worn in life, and it clutched my ankle as it looked like his arm stretched from his body, so it hung halfway down the stairs behind him like a fire hose. Patches stood at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in his soiled, cast-off clothes, and grinned his gap-toothed smile, which had become decidedly moldy in death. He started pulling on me as I struggled to get back to my feet. Patches was a tramp, a sort of city pet, and the residents thought he gave our town a colorful appearance. They'd all grown up with Mayberry and Mayfield. Small towns were expected to have a friendly tramp who stole the occasional pie or was caught sleeping off a bottle at the bus station. Patches never stole any pies. He was welcome to a piece on the front porch of almost any house in town. But he was drunk most any old night of the week. He could be seen staggering out of Jimmer's and down to his camp by the river most any old night of the week. He never caused any trouble, though, and the police never felt the need to throw him in the drunk tank or hassle him at all. I would have called us friends at one time. Everybody in town hired Patches to do odd jobs for a little money now and then. He had a rusty old push mower that he'd used to cut people's grass with, and he claimed he'd been a handyman of some sort before the war. He had enough skill with tools to back it up, so most any afternoon he could be seen cutting grass or shoveling snow or fixing something for a few dollars to feed and medicate himself. Medicating is what Dad called it when Patches got drunk. Patches had laughed when I'd told him so. He fixed my bike tire once, and he'd taken Scotty Randall and I on a hike in the woods once when we had asked if he knew any good camping spots. He was a nice guy, sober or drunk, and I don't think I'd ever seen anyone in town have any trouble with him. We shouldn't have pranked him. It was wrong. I wish now that I could take it back. Pranking him had been Billy's idea, but we'd all gone along with it. Billy's dad owned the hardware store, and he was just about the only guy in town that didn't really trust Patches. Billy's dad headed out for tramps and vags, and he taught his son to be mindful of them as well. Tramps like a no-good dog pretending to be good. He'd tell us when he saw Patches wandering around, "You might pet him 100 times and not get bit, but when you take your eyes off him for half a heartbeat, he'll bite you." I didn't think Patches was like that, but we knew better than to argue with an adult, so we just nodded and said we'd be careful. Billy had a roach, the rubber kind that you got from the joke shop for a nickel, and he put it deep down in a corned beef sandwich and told me to take it over to Patches. "Why me?" I asked, not really wanting to prank Patches, but not wanting to seem chicken. "He trusts you. Your dad's always paying him to do stuff, and I've seen him talking to you on the front porch," Billy said. "He hasn't gotten work for a few days now, what with this heat, and he's probably getting hungry. He'll bite down on that sandwich and see the roach and freak out." We all laughed a little at the thought of Patches biting down on that roach and freaking out. We'd have all freaked out too if we found a roach in a sandwich. Afterwards, we'd all have a good laugh and find someone else to prank. He looked up from where he was sunning himself and smiled his gap-toothed smile at me. "Oh, well, hey there, Johnny-O. What you say, old sport?" he asked in his thick southern drawl. "Nothing much. My mom packed me a corned beef sandwich for lunch, but I'm not really a big fan of corned beef. I thought you might like it." I held the sandwich out to him and tried my best not to smile. Patches took the bait at once. "Oh, well, say there, that's mighty fine of you, old sport. Been here a day and a half since I had me any victuals." He took the sandwich and had a big bite, chewing with relish. "By the way, I saw Miss Laverne's washing machine." He slapped his knee as he gave a big donkey laugh. "I was 3 hours cleaning the mud out of that contraption. I guess I should thank you boys for the work." He laughed a little and took another bite, and when he did, I saw the gleaming head of the plastic roach sticking out of the sandwich. I started to point it out, but he kept right on laughing and telling me about the muddy washing machine and how hard it had been to get all the mud out of it. Apparently, he'd had to remove the drum and rinse it in the yard and then put the whole contraption back together. When he'd finished, and it was time to get paid, He took another bite and said through a mouthful of corned beef, "You know that old skinflint only gave me $1 for all that work. She tells me not to spend it all in one place." He brayed more laughter, but as he went to bite again, something happened. He wheezed a bit, his throat working to swallow the load of corned beef, and I realized with horror that he'd swallowed the plastic roach, too. The mat of corned beef and the hard plastic roach were stuck in his throat, and as he coughed and gasped, I realized he was choking. Billy, Randall, and Scotty broke cover and ran over to see what had happened, but by then, it was already too late. He had melted to his knees in the dirt, coughing his life out as the wad of half-chewed food hung like plaster in his throat. All the backslapping in the world wouldn't do anything for him. We sent Scotty and Randall to call an ambulance, but Patches was dead before they even left the riverside. His face was a dark purple color at the end as he clawed at his throat. Billy and I clapped him on the back again and again, but we might as well have been slapping a tree trunk. If you've never seen a man choke to death, then you may not know what it looks like, but I'm here to tell you that it's not as clean as it looks on TV. Patches hacked and coughed, tried to bring it up, clawed at his throat until his skin bled, and then, finally, he gave both of us a final look and pitched over onto his face, a look of terror and confusion stamped there forever. The hand gripped my ankle, and I could feel his fingers trying to twist it through the shoe. Maybe he meant to break it. Maybe he just wanted to make me hurt bad enough to let go. Whatever his intention, I wasn't about to play along. I twisted my foot a little and let the sneaker slip off as it slapped back into his palm like a rubber band. Patches howled in rage, but I wasn't going to give him a chance to recover. I sprinted up the stairs and slammed my door closed behind me. I shot the lock and pushed the desk in front of the door as I thought about how best to escape. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, but I needed a plan before I went. I grabbed my backpack from the closet and threw some clothes into it, taking the $10 out of my desk I'd been saving for a new bike and putting it in my pocket. I stuffed my scout sleeping bag in as well. I felt a surge of joy for half a second when I remembered my old rifle my dad had used for hunting ducks in the fall, but that joy withered when I remembered that it was locked up in my dad's gun safe in the basement. I settled for a Swiss Army knife and a little fire starter kit that Randall had given me for my birthday, and took one last look around. Some baseball cards went in, maybe I could sell them, and a nice pocket watch my granddad had given me before I stopped and realized it was too quiet outside. Why wasn't he trying to get in? I put my hiking boots on and stuffed some socks into the bag before I slung it on and looked at the window. It would be a long drop to the ground, but I could hang off the kitchen roof and maybe not break my ankle if I was careful. My eyes flicked back to the door, and for a moment, I felt the urge to fling it open and confront my attacker head on. The suicidal urge passed quickly, though, and I crept over to the door and laid my ear against it instead, trying to hear what might be going on the other side. The bang from the other side made me jump back in fright, and Patches laughed his donkey bray. "Ha ha ha ha! Come out, Johnny! There's no escape now!" The ambulance had come, and the paramedics had pronounced him DRT, dead right there. Warner Mads, the fat volunteer firefighter who was on paramedic duty that day, had laughed when he said it, but none of the rest of us found it very funny. We all watched them put him on the stretcher and cover him with a sheet before they slid him into the covered truck they used as an ambulance and took him to Porter's mortuary. We spent the next week in a state of pure dread. "What if they find that roach in his throat?" Randall would say as we tried to get back to normal. "What if they cut him open and find it, and they decide that we killed him?" Billy punched him in the arm after we had all ignored him for about the 1,000th time. "So what if they do? It's not like we meant to kill him. We just wanted to prank him, that's all." "But what?" Randall started, but Billy punched him again, and Randall knocked off so he could rub at his arm. "Shut up, Randy. If you keep talking about it, then someone's going to start asking questions. Why don't you guys come stay over at my house? My dad's working the late shift, and Johnny's parents are out of town, so he's staying with me anyway. We can have a sleepover and forget all about this crap." We all agreed that sounded like fun, and when the sun set Friday night, we were all sitting around a camp lantern in Billy's room telling scary stories. Billy had wanted a fire, but his dad had absolutely forbidden it, and so the best we could hope for was the small lantern on the floor of his room. His mom had gone to bed shortly after dinner, saying how tired she was, and we'd been left to our own devices for hours. We'd played games, watched a little TV in the living room, and raided the kitchen for snacks before finally deciding that it was time for the traditional scary stories. Billy got to tell the first one since it was his house, and he told us about an escaped asylum patient who'd killed the previous owner of this very house. He claimed that on quiet nights you could still hear them begging for their lives and the almost inaudible sound of a man dragging his knife along the wall as he hunted for the last of the children in the house. Randy got pretty scared, but that was far from new. After Patches, he seemed to be scared by most everything. Thinking of Patches made me think of a story of my own to tell, but I hesitated and let Scotty go first. Scotty told a story about a skinned dog who killed a bunch of boys on a camping trip, and even though a skinned dog with bones poking out and his jaws full of slobber sounded a little scary, it was pretty stupid all told. When one of the boys managed to kill it and discovered that there was a whole pack of them that then ripped him to shreds, we all rolled our eyes and threw our pillows at him. He laughed and threw his back, and one pillow fight later, Billy asked if I had a story. I do, actually, but it's not really a story. I thought I saw Patches the other day. Everyone went quiet. Randall looked like a goose had walked over his grave. Scotty sucked air through his teeth, and Billy punched me in the arm in a less than playful way. That ain't funny, man. That ain't funny a little bit. But I told him I wasn't joking. I'd seen him on and off for days since his death. Pressed up against the glass of the grocery store, his gap teeth covered in mold and his face a purple and red patchwork. At his old camp when my dad and I drove past, and even when I didn't see him, I could swear I smelled the odor of peppermint candy and rock gut whiskey, the smells of Patches. But last night was the worst yet. I woke up all of a sudden and there was someone standing at the end of my bed. I thought it might be my dad, checking up on me, and then I smelled the peppermint and the sweet smell of alcohol, and I knew who it was. I didn't say anything, but he smiled at me from the foot of my bed, and his mossy teeth glinted in the moonlight. "That was a rotten trick, Johnny," he whispered, and his voice was hoarse and cracking. "Maybe I'll come play a trick on you boys sometime. See how you like it. Sleep tight then." Then I blinked, and he was just gone. They all sat there gape-mouthed for a heartbeat or two, and then Randall started laughing. It wasn't real laughter, not really, but the crazy, jagged laughter that people make when they're scared and they don't know what else to do. He reached out and grabbed a big handful of popcorn and said, "Good one, Johnny," as he stuffed it into his mouth and kept laughing. The laughs turned into gasps, though, as he started to choke on the popcorn. The three of us got up, wanting to stop him before he choked to death, but as he knelt hacking, we could see his hands clawing not at his throat, but at the black-gloved hands wrapped around his neck. Patches had leaned around the back of his head then, grinning like a monster in a movie, and Randall's clutching hands had died like two birds in their death throes. We backed away from him, not sure what to make of this grisly phantom, and he stood to his full height so he could tower over us. Randall lay still on the floor then, his coughing done, and the three of us silently wondered who would be next. "So, Billy, you like roaches, do you?" the cadaverous thing asked, turning towards the terrified boy who stood frozen to the spot. "Well, here then, have some, won't you?" Billy gagged, and a single glistening roach fell from his lips. He stared at it dumbly before he retched, and a cascade of them pattered to the floor and scattered like roaches. He went to all fours and kept vomiting up the glistening insects, his body racked with sobs and heaves as Patches laughed merrily over his handiwork. It was too much. I bolted for the door and never saw what happened to Scotty. I threw open the living room door and ran out into the night, but I could hear the laughter of that mad apparition behind me as I fled for the safety of home. I believed, in my youth, in the talismanic protection of home, and as Patches dogged my heels, I could see it getting closer and closer before me. I found my keys and rammed them into the lock, and as the door closed behind me, I was certain I was safe. Sitting in my room now, I realized I would never be safe again. Sitting on my sleeping bag and writing this down, I realized I haven't been safe for the last 20 years. I fled that night with my backpack and my fear, and God forgive me, I never looked back. I later found out that the deaths of my 3 friends were the talk of the small town, and many believed that I had been abducted by whoever had done the killing. I used the money I had to get as far away as I could from my hometown, and when it was gone, I worked for men who would hire a boy my age to do a day's work. This was 1974, so there were kids on the run all over, and one more didn't really strike much interest. When I couldn't work, I begged, and when I found someone willing to take me in for a few days, I stayed. Eventually, though, I would have to move on again or risk being caught in the shadow of Patches. Patches didn't stay in my hometown after all. No matter where I went, I would see him somewhere eventually, reflected in the window of a store, half hidden in an alley between 2 buildings. Sometimes I'd smell that sickly sweet smell of him and know it was time to get a move on. I took up the bottle early, and as I got older, came to realize that in my own sad way, I had become Patches. I'd become a living monument to the man I had killed on accident, and I suppose I was just looking for a place like my hometown where I could feel safe. I guess I found it now. The truck dropped me off by the familiar river I had so often swam in when I was young, and as the sun set, I found the ragged remains of Patches' old camp. The town has changed, as I knew it would, and the attendant at the corner store gave me a dirty look as I used my last $5 to pick up a bottle of Irish Rose whiskey. I didn't care. By tomorrow, I'd just be another curiosity piece in the local paper. Homeless man found murdered by the river, it would likely say. And after 20 years of running, I guess that's not too bad. The bottle's half gone now. So was the sun as I sit here making my final notes. I'm sitting in the spot where his camp used to be, and the sounds of the river, the frogs, and the crickets just tuning up behind me, are almost soothing as I wait for my death to come. He'll find me now, I'm sure of it, and after all this time, it's almost a relief. A shadow has fallen over me, and a familiar voice asks, "You gonna finish that bottle, Johnny?" I looked up into the unchanging face of horror. I hand it up to him and smile. The celebration of Purga De Rata was a celebration that was highly anticipated in my town. The celebration is always capped off by the hunting of the mice, which was the highlight of the event. On the first day of the feast, we opened the door to find 3 masks attached to our doorknob. This occurred year after year for as long as I could remember, and I didn't think it was strange at all. Every year we would open the door, find the cat masks, long, wiry whiskers and pointy black ears, hanging from the doorknob to our home. There would be one for my mother, one for my father, and one for me. We would wear them at the festival, riding the rides and playing the games, lifting them only slightly to eat food at the feast as we gave praise to Saint Rocher. This year, however, was special for me. I was 13, old enough to do a day's work if I chose, old enough to have my own money and to have my own responsibilities, old enough to participate in what came after the feast, old enough to participate in the Purga De Rata. I had always watched from the windows of the council hall with the other children as the people in the cat masks went about freeing us from the rats. You could see them sometimes, the big rats with their pointed noses and coarse whiskers, running through the streets as the cats turned them from wherever they had been hiding. I asked Mother what they were. They were larger than the rats I had seen in the pantry on occasions, and she had told me that these were the undesirables, those who Saint Rocher had chosen to purge from the community, and that it was the job of the town to become his cats and free the community of them. I asked her once if we could be chosen by Saint Rocher to be purged on that night. She told me I'd better pray it never happened. Those who were purged during the Purga De Rata were cursed and removed from the town after they were destroyed. This was the year I would discover what that truly meant. I went to the festival in my mask, excited for the night to come. As I played the games, danced the Purga De Rata, and ate at the feast, I couldn't help but think of taking to the streets with my father and mother that night to help purge the unclean from our town. Mother had said that they were Saint Rocher's enemies, said that her father had said they were filled with spirits who had brought the plague to our city when she was a girl. If they didn't purge all of them, they would bring it there again. I was excited to go out and bring honor to my family as I drove these rats out of the city, but I was a little scared too. It was that feeling you get just before doing something dangerous and exciting, like riding a wild horse. You fear the action, but you can't wait for the ride. I was a little sad though. My friend Maria wasn't there. She never missed the festival, and not seeing her made me wonder if she was sick. Her father wasn't a nice man, my father said. He didn't support the festival, and he had tried to argue for having it canceled many times. He always seemed nice to me when I visited Maria, but I knew well enough not to argue with my father. I didn't see Maria all day, and as we went home with the setting sun, I hoped I would see her tonight. We returned home and ate at the midnight feast that my parents always ate before it was time to go to the night's work. I tucked in greedily, knowing that I would need my strength for what was to come. God help me. I was so young, I didn't know what was in store for me. As we ate, I asked my mother about the people who didn't go to the festival. She looked critically, asking what I meant. I told her I saw someone peeking through the windows of their home. They'd moved away from the window quickly, but I had marked them by their whiskers and their beady eyes. Mother said that those people were not to be trusted, and that clearly they had been infested by the spirits Saint Rocher wanted us to expel from the city that night. I nodded, making a note of that house in my mind. Their house was close to ours, and my parents and I could get there easily and chase them out. When the deep thrum of the midnight bell tolled, Father donned his mask and led us to the kitchen. There would be no need to take me to the chapel for safekeeping that night. He handed each of us a knife from the knife block, saving the sharpest knife for me. It was a long, curved fillet knife, and he told me not to be afraid to swing it hard. These aren't people anymore, and we must expunge the plague from the city. I nodded, not understanding entirely, but I soon would. We left the house, and I took them to the house I had seen earlier, seeing the other cats as they moved through the city. They were moving in clusters, groups of 5 or 10, and soon we would be taken into the clouder easily. The other cats around me were a comfortable weight, all of them people I knew, though I didn't know that I knew them. They followed us as we went, letting us lead them to the rats. The lights were off when we approached, the house dark and the windows shuttered. I figured this would be the time that we would scare the mice out of their holes. I'd seen my kitten, Georgette, scare mice out of their holes before. She would pretend to be interested in one hole, and then when the mice would poke their heads out of the other hole and come hesitantly out, she would dash at them and scare them out of the house. She would run them and run them. Her little kitten energy was boundless, until Mother finally saw them, swept them out with her broom, crying, "Purga De Rata," as she swept them from our house. But we were no kittens, it seems, and this city did not hunt like that. The stone made me jump when it crashed through the window. The window shattered inward, and I heard someone shriek. We had scared the rats, and now they would come running out. But this was also how kittens hunted. Several of the cats, the ones with clubs as well as knives, cleared the glass out of the window and climbed through easily. The shrieks from inside were undoubtedly more human than mouse-like, but when the door burst open, one of the rats ran for it, just like the rats at home. No broom came out to sweep him away. The clouder fell on him, and I saw his hands come up to reach as the knives came down. I stopped as I saw what they were doing, feeling a little sick, as I saw the blood leaking from the rat. He was bigger than I had expected, bigger than me, and he twitched as he lay there. I took a step back, not really wanting to get close, but my mother pushed me forward as her hands stopped my retreat. I looked back into her cat mask and saw her gentle eyes as she pushed me again. "Go on, honey. Get a cut in." I stepped forward, some of my excitement dulled by fear, and saw the gurgling rat looking up at me as it bled onto the cobbles. Its black eyes stared at me, and it coughed wetly, though its lips didn't move. I held my knife in a shaky hand, preparing to strike, when the rat suddenly reached out for me, locking its hand around my ankles. My fear gripped me, and I suddenly stabbed out with the knife. I stabbed the rat again and again and again, closing my eyes as I stabbed his arm, his back, his neck. The hand went limp as he flopped onto the cobbles. The Clowder cheered, and we were off again. We ran, drunk off our own power, and found a pair of rats in the street as they dodged another group. They were cutting down an alley as we came upon them, but they looked up at our group as it came close. One of them took off down the alley, but the other just stood there, frozen in terror, as the Clowder fell on her. She screamed as we stabbed her, but I broke off to pursue the other one as they finished stabbing and beating her. I didn't want her to get away, and my blood was up. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one of the rats for myself, too. I ran after her, leaving the others behind, and found her just as she hit the wall of the alley. She turned, seeing me, and started looking around fitfully. I could almost taste her fear as I closed in, knife at the ready. I, too, would purge my town of rats. "Please," she begged, and her words gave me pause. She was speaking. Did rats speak? None of the rats I'd ever seen spoke. Of course, none of the rats I had ever seen were big either. The speaking rat made me falter for a moment, and she took full advantage of this as she tried to reason with me. Please don't hurt me. I'll give you whatever you want. I just don't want to die." I heard the Clowder coming up behind me, yelling as they came, and their presence gave me strength. I ran forward, and I shoved the knife at her, the blade sinking into her abdomen as she tried to back away. As it went in, I yelled, "Purga De Rata!" and I could see her dress starting to redden as her hands gripped the knife. She cut her fingers, and she fell to her knees as the Clowder came into the alley with a shout of mirth. I pulled the knife out and ran to my father. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You're a natural." At that moment, I was so proud. My family was doing something special, and we were united. Sometimes it almost felt like we lived on our own, only seeing each other for dinner. But now we were doing something we could all enjoy, and I couldn't wait till next year. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing, but I would soon find out. I followed the Clowder, growing bolder as we went, until we came to the next house. They pounded on the door, yelling for the rats to come out and face their fate. Everyone else was waiting expectantly, waiting for the door to open so they could charge the house and kill these rats. I was confused, though. There must have been a mistake. This couldn't be the rats' house. They were looking for rocks to break the window, but I just shook my head and felt my confusion mount. This couldn't be the right house. This was Maria's house. The door opened suddenly, and Maria's father stepped out onto the stoop. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was set in a stoic cast, and he raised his rifle and pointed it at the mob. Some of them backed away, but most of them only seemed to take more pleasure from his presence. They mumbled to themselves, gripping their knives and preparing to charge. Maria's father cast his gaze around at them, his eyes falling on me for a moment before sliding away. "I'm not wearing that damn mask. This whole celebration is an abomination. If you mean to take my family, then you can come and try. I'll take a few of you with me. Just remember, which of you will be wearing a rat mask next year?" I backed away from the Clowder, slowly, my knife hitting the cobbles. No one noticed the metallic sound, or the scream that followed it as the rifle blammed loudly. One of the cats had charged him, thinking he wouldn't shoot, and now he lay bleeding on his doorstep. The gun went off again a moment later, but I didn't see who had been killed that time. I was running, head down, my mask forgotten, as I turned from the carnage that I now understood was not a magic festival or a fight for our town from giant rats. We were killing our friends, our neighbors, and I would never understand why. I ran as the tears streamed down my face, and I didn't stop running until the sounds of rats and cats were behind me. I ran until the woods enveloped me. the lush fairy tale woods that seemed to surround our home. The trees whipped at me, the roots pulled at me, and I just kept running. I ran from the horror, from the chaos, and I didn't stop until the ground went out from under me. Suddenly I was tumbling. I was rolling down something, and I put my hands up to my face to protect myself. I was so confused, so frightened, and when I hit my head on something, my vision got very blurry. I kept rolling, struggling to maintain my consciousness. I was slapping against the bushes and banging against small rocks, and when I finally came to a rest, I felt warm, solid ground beneath me. When the lights engulfed me, leaving me in a warm circle, I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. The nurses said I had been found lying on a major highway, a truck driver having brought me here after calling the police. I had been unconscious for a while, a day at least, and I had a pretty massive head wound that would need to heal. The doctor said I had a small skull fracture, and that I definitely had a concussion. They kept me for a month, most of which was trying to get me to tell them who I was and where I was from. I feigned memory loss. The women in Mother's books lost their memories sometimes after an accident. I did not want to go back home. I knew for a fact that if I went home, after running away from the festival, that my family might very well find rat masks on their door next year. I also didn't want to face the wrath of my parents and my community. No one refused to participate in the festival, or, like Maria's father, they were made to play the rats. After a month, I was sent to an orphanage where I was adopted. The country I'm from doesn't have the best track record when it comes to placing children into foster homes, or even having them adopted by good families, but I suppose I got lucky. Glenda and Mark were from the United States, here to do missionary work. When Glenda heard about my story, she became interested in me. She said that it seemed to be God's will that she help me, and they adopted me right then and there. They stayed for a few years, helping me get back on my feet, and when they went home, they helped me gain citizenship, become a United States citizen. I moved with them to San Diego and attended college. I never told them about my village, or the Purga De Rata, and they never pushed me. I think they suspected that my amnesia was self-inflicted, and they're honestly the best parents I ever could have asked for. I'm 30 now, married with a new baby in a place of my own. My husband, Marco, is a wonderful father, and we couldn't be happier. He works as a civil engineer for a large company, and I work as a nurse when I'm not at home with Hugo. Glenda and Mark, my mom and dad, are always welcome at our house, and I can't imagine a better life than the one I have. A life that my past is threatening to take away. You see, when I went to get the mail today, I noticed something hanging on the door of our apartment. I saw the masks, laughing and thinking it was a Halloween thing from the neighbors. But when I picked them up, the wiry whiskers stuck painfully into my hand. I dropped them and stared in horror. They were masks, all right. 3 of them, and they all were gray lacquered faces of rats. The whiskers were frayed metal wires, and the nose of one had been broken in the fall, a delicate black bulb that now lay on the pavement beside the mask. There were 3 masks, as I said, and the third was the one that filled me with the most dread. 2 were normal-sized, easily capable of fitting an adult face, but the third was small, delicate, the eyes carved to make it look scared and sad. A mask for a baby. There was a note inside one, and I thought I would tear it as my shaking hands reached out to open it. The paper was rough, handmade, and the ink was thick and blocky. The village made its own paper, its own ink, and rarely traded with others. I had no doubt that the masks had been made by the same old man that used to make them every year. I felt the tears come on, and as I read the note, the concrete bit into my knees as I went down to them to sob into the paper. The note read, "Joyous Purga Rinvadaro. Join us this evening for the Purga De Ratas. If you cannot attend, don't worry. We will bring the celebration to you." "Oh my God, there it is! Stop the car, Jacob!" Lily exclaimed as the house she saw in the ad came into view. Lily and Jacob had been in the same neighborhood for most of their 12-year marriage. They had liked the area when they moved in, but the peaceful neighborhood had seen its share of crime and decline lately. The straw that broke the camel's back and made them decide to move had been 3 nights ago when they'd been out to dinner. They'd been celebrating their 12-year anniversary when someone broke into their house and ransacked the place. Anything of value that wasn't locked in the safe was taken. When the police finally got there, they acted as though they couldn't care less. There was absolutely no help. So the next day, Lily went online to find a new house within their price range. Lo and behold, she found a lovely house a few neighborhoods over, on the nicer side of town. It was a closer commute to Jacob's work and was well within their price range. Lily wasted no time calling the number on the ad and setting up a walkthrough. They had set it up for that Saturday morning, but when Saturday arrived, Lily had gotten a short text telling her to go ahead and have a look at the place and sending her the code to the key box on the door. The owners said that they wouldn't be able to make it, but if they wanted to take a look, they could go right ahead, just to be sure to return the key when they were done and let them know what they thought. Jacob was very reluctant and wanted Lily to reschedule for a time when the owner could join them, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. She threatened to go herself, but that seemed to make up Jacob's mind, and he agreed to come with her. As they pulled into the driveway, Lily could hardly contain herself. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the porch, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The scent of gardenias filled her nose, the smell reminding her of summers she spent at her grandmother's house as a child. In fact, the front porch reminded her a little of her grandparents' house, too. The long porch stretched the whole front of the house, and it had several weather-worn rockers and a swing hanging from a pair of chains. Had her grandmother had a swing like that? Had Lily sat on it and swung when she was a little girl? Had she gone too high, perhaps? And Jacob leaned out the window, his hand over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's work. I gotta take this. I'll catch up with you as soon as I get done." Lily gave him a tart look and shrugged. She took one more deep breath before mounting the porch and approaching the front door. She had seen it on Zillow when she was looking for houses, and it had been one of the biggest reasons she wanted the place. It had 8 squares on the front. There was red, green, and green again, just like her grandparents' door. She could remember standing in front of the door as a little girl, feeling excited as she waited for it to open. Since her grandmother wasn't going to come to let her in this time, she put in the code and got the key to open the door. The door opened with a little creak, and Lily stepped inside with a broad grin. Jacob looked up at Lily as she walked into the house, thinking of how beautiful she looked as she walked past the threshold. He couldn't have known this, but it would be the last time he'd ever see her. As Lily stepped into the front hall of the house, she felt a bit of deja vu. She felt like she was coming home, as if she'd been here 1,000 times before. On her right was a large archway that led into a sitting room. Lily decided to check out that room first, since it was the closest, and there was a window so she could look out and see if Jacob was coming in. As she walked into the room, she felt a strange change in the atmosphere, the whole thing beginning to shift. Lily walked to the window to call out to Jacob, but when she looked outside, his car was no longer in the driveway. Instead, there were several familiar-looking vehicles. Was that her parents' car from when she was 9? And that car looked like Aunt Judy's car. That truck parked on the street looked just like her grandparents'. But that was impossible. She'd watched her mom sell that car when she was 10. What was going on here? As she stood there confused, she heard a voice calling to her. Lily turned around, but she was no longer alone. Her family filled the couch and chairs. The room looked just like her grandma's sitting room from when she was a kid. She could remember seeing everyone seated like this once before, and the memory made her feel kind of crawly. As a child, they had often sat in her grandmother's sitting room during holidays or special occasions, but something was off today. Something wasn't quite how she remembered it. Everyone looked as though they had been crying. She didn't remember this scene from her childhood quite like this. Something was very wrong. As she abandoned her place next to the window, she walked as though in a haze to where her mother sat. She looked up as Lily approached and patted the couch next to her, motioning for her to sit. Her mother put an arm around her, not an altogether familiar feeling, and when Lily spoke, her voice was that of a very young child. "What's wrong, Mama?" Lily asked, looking around at everyone and seeing tears welling up in their eyes. Her father spoke first, though. "Lilybug, there's been an accident. Your grandmother fell down the basement stairs. She didn't make it." As those words left his mouth, everyone began to wail, and Lily felt her mother press her face against her head. Lily, however, sat speechless, trying to process what she'd heard. This wasn't how she remembered this. Was it? Lily got up from her spot on the couch and began to pace. Her memory of that day was fuzzy, but as she walked between the couch and the window, it began to solidify. She remembered her family telling her that her grandma had gone to live in Boca, not that she was dead. When Lily turned back to confront her mother, though, she found that she was alone in the sitting room again. The furniture, her family, everything was gone. The room was as it was when she walked through the front door, and Lily shuddered as a palpable chill ran through her. "Looks like a goose walked over your grave," she heard her grandmother say, and it was as if she were just in the next room. Lily rushed to the front door to get out of the house, wanting nothing so much as to smell the gardenias again, before she jumped into the car and told Jacob to drive away. She should have listened to him. She should have waited, but she'd been so eager to see this place. It had brought back so many memories, so many times that made her feel young again. But that was gone now. She didn't care how dangerous their neighborhood was. She would gladly live there for the rest of time if it meant that she could leave this mausoleum. The door, however, was gone. The entryway was still there, but the wall where the front door should be was a blank. She ran back to the sitting room window and started pounding on it, trying to get Jacob's attention. His car was back, and he was sitting in the front seat, but he didn't seem to hear her. "Jacob, please, help me!" she screamed, but Jacob didn't answer. He glanced up, but then looked back down to the phone, talking with Terry or Mark or whoever it was calling him from work. He couldn't see her. He didn't know she was stuck. And suddenly Lily realized she was alone. If she was going to get out of here, she'd have to do it herself. Lily thought she might as well look for another way out, and as if summoned, she noticed the hallway that ran opposite the sitting room. There would be a bathroom down there, if she remembered right, and some cold water on her face sounded exactly like what she needed. She headed to the bathroom, but as she got closer, she felt that strange shivering again. As she came closer, she could hear the sound of sloshing water, as if someone was splashing frantically in the bathtub. Lily stepped cautiously to the door that separated the hall from the small bathroom, and peeked in as the wooden barrier made a funny squeaking sound. She could see her father, knelt down at the side of the tub, and she could see him holding her mother's head under the water. Lily stepped back, the door opening to give her a terrible view of her mother's drowning. But it all seemed wrong. That wasn't how she remembered that horrible time when she was 12. Was it? Lily remembered her father trying to help her mother out of the tub when she'd had a seizure. She remembered him trying, but not being able to save her. This new reality of what really happened hurt her brain more than her heart, and Lily tore off in a mad scramble to be away from the awful sound of her mother drowning again and again. Lily ran to the staircase that lay beyond the foyer and darted up the steps without thinking of where she was going. As she ran into one of the bedrooms, her mind still reeling from the scene below, the feeling of déjà vu came yet again. As she turned to take in the room that she had just run into, she could see a crib with a mobile twirling overhead. The smiling yellow ducks spun drunkenly, but even their placidity couldn't bring joy to the scene. This was her son's room. "No," she pleaded, "not this memory." Her husband walked into the room, holding their 3-week-old son to his chest. It should have brought her joy to see him again, till she realized her wonderful husband was holding little Jonathan's face to his chest, muffling the sound of his cries. He didn't seem to notice her watching him, didn't seem to care at all that he was snuffing the life from what would be their only child. After the baby had stopped crying, Jacob quietly kissed him on his little cheek and placed him in his crib. But no, that's not how it had gone at all. Lily's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered Jacob holding their baby and comforting him till he fell asleep. When she had woken up and noticed that Jonathan hadn't woken up for his feeding yet, she went to his room and found him cold and blue in his crib. She screamed for her husband, and Jacob had rushed to her side to find her cradling their poor baby as if she could bring him back to life. They called 911, but when the EMTs arrived, they said it was too late. His death was stated as SIDS, and the two had been left to mourn their loss. Lily didn't know how much more she could take in this house. She slid down the wall, crying as the crib vanished, and the room once again was empty. Lily sat there for a few minutes, getting her bearings. Then she got up and slowly walked down the stairs. She didn't want to see any more, but she knew that she had to get out of this house if she intended to have any sanity left when she escaped. As Jacob sat in the front seat, talking to his boss, he realized that Lily hadn't come out of the house yet. It had been at least an hour since he'd told her he'd catch up with her, and she should have been able to see the whole place twice in an hour. He looked up at the window that overlooked the front yard, hoping to see her looking out at him, but no such luck. "Listen, Mark, we can handle the rest of this on Monday. I need to check on Lily. She's alone in the house we're both supposed to be looking at, and I'm getting a little worried about her." "Okay, that's fine. See you Monday. Bye." As Jacob climbed out of the car and walked towards the porch, he could smell a familiar smell. He stopped in the walkway and took a deep whiff, savoring the scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was bourbon and cigar smoke, and it reminded him of the Saturday night poker games at his dad's house. Dad's poker games had been full of both, and Jacob remembered peeking in as a kid so he could watch the festivities. As he got to the door and tried to open it to join his wife, the door was locked. He knocked, wondering why she had locked it behind herself if she wanted him to come take a look. "Lily, let me in, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took so long, but you know how much of a windbag Mark can be." But Lily didn't respond. He knocked a little louder, but still no response. At this point, Jacob began to worry that something had happened to her. He pounded on the door, his fears coming back at the thought of what could be happening to his wife. Hadn't he thought this sounded like a great way to get robbed or kidnapped? He didn't know this guy from Adam, and he had just let his wife go in alone. What had he been thinking? "Lily," he yelled as he beat on the door, but no answer came. Lily walked down the steps and into the basement as if in a trance. She was numb from the torture that this house had put her through, and just wanted to be outside in the sun again before it could show her anything else. As she descended the basement stairs, the air shifted again, and she steadied herself for what was next. She opened her eyes to see that she was in her own basement, but something was off. The shelves where she kept the Christmas ornaments were pushed away from the wall. As she walked over to see why it was pulled away, she saw a trap door under where the shelf usually was. The door was open, and Lily could hear something down there. Whatever it was crying out softly, as though too weak to scream. Jacob, worried and a little angry, decided to try to find another way in. He walked around to the back of the house, but as he came to the gate, he too felt that overpowering sense of déjà vu. When he got to the backyard, he saw a swing set that looked lonely in the open space. It looked like his own swing set from when he was a kid, and he walked curiously towards it. When he reached the swing, Jacob sat down and looked at the back door. He realized it was his childhood door, and scrunched up his eyes as he tried to make sense of it. He'd spent a lot of time on his swing while his dad talked with his mom. As he watched the window by the door, Jacob saw people inside talking loudly, their silhouettes performing sad little plays for this child's eyes to watch. But this isn't how he remembered this happening. It had been just another fight, his dad starting it like always. The mailman had been sitting at their kitchen table when he came home, a cold towel on his head, as he drank a glass of his mom's lemonade. He had nearly collapsed on the front lawn in the heat, and though his father had smiled when he saw the man cooling off in his kitchen, Jacob had seen his mother flinch when he looked at her. His father had waited till after dinner to tell his son to go play out back while they talked, and his mother had seemed to beg him with her eyes not to leave. Jacob watched as his dad reached for something on the counter, and his mom's silhouette backed away slowly. His dad lunged with a sudden rage, and Jacob imagined he could hear the frying pan connect with the side of her head. His dad's dark afterimage stood over her for a few minutes, the pan coming down a few more times until sanity seemed to reassert itself. He stood up, the image realizing that it had talked a little too vigorously this time. Jacob could almost see the lack of confidence in the outline as it weighed its options. When it looked out at him, Jacob realized his father meant to make him an accomplice to his folly. "Jacob," his father yelled from the doorway, "get me a shovel from the shed. Then I need you to get in the truck and wait for me." Jacob hopped dutifully off the swing, with much smaller feet than his own. He was horrified at his blind fanaticism, but understood it all too well. As he ran to the shed to fetch the shovel, he realized that the memory of the night his mother left him wasn't the way he remembered it. Dad wasn't planning a garden to surprise her with, and Mom hadn't left them for a fella who ran the register at Ralph's. He did what he was told, though, and grabbed the shovel. He gave it to his dad and ran to the truck as his father began grunting at something that must have been very heavy in the kitchen. It couldn't have been his mother. Jacob's mom ate like a bird. Surely he wouldn't have strained so much to lift her. As soon as Jacob got in the truck, everything became hazy again. He realized he was back in his own car, his father's truck gone. As Jacob sat there, he began to cry. He didn't want to cry. He hadn't cried in so long, but found the tears just wouldn't stop. He was terrified of what had just happened. He was scared of a man he had buried 10 years ago. He was grieving for his mother in a way that he had never managed to when he was 8. Above all else, Jacob was worried about his wife. "Hello?" Lily whispered as she descended the stairs. "Who's down there? Do you need help?" She whispered, understanding the irony of her question a little too late. As she spoke, the whimpering stopped. It was dark and damp down here, the floor made of packed earth, and the smell of dirt and iron filled her nose. As she felt around for a light switch, she could hear something shifting across the room. Lily paused for a second, trying to listen to what it was. It was hard to hear over the sound of her heart beating in her ears, and Lily was afraid of getting snuck up on down here by the specters in the house again. She found a small chain hanging from a bulb in the ceiling. As she pulled it, the small light lit the room pathetically, but what she saw still terrified her. This was not any memory that she had ever had. She looked to where the sound was coming from and found herself staring back at her from a dirty mattress on the floor. She was battered and beaten, starved, with one hand attached to the wall by a metal cuff. Lily, in shock, started to back away, but heard someone walking into the basement. She quickly turned off the light and backed up against the wall, praying the darkness would hide her. As the steps got closer, Lily felt around for something to defend herself with, in case the person came downstairs. As she slid her hand across the cold dirt floor, she found what felt like a pipe, and picked it up as quickly as possible, holding it to her chest. A few moments later, she could hear heavy footsteps coming down the cellar stairs. She closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't be seen. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in front of the front door. Jacob got himself together and returned to the backyard to find a way in. The swing set was gone, as was the shed. The back door was no longer his childhood back door either. This door was white, with a blue ruffle at the top of the window, and the realization made him feel a little bit better. He pushed up the 3 steps to the door and turned the knob. The door opened easily, and as he walked over the threshold into the kitchen, he felt the shift again. He was in his dad's kitchen, and his father was talking to the police officer. "Mr. Daniels, do you know of anywhere your ex-wife would have gone?" the officer asked, tapping his pencil on an ancient-looking notebook. "No, officer. Like I've told you before, she called me 3 weeks ago asking to pick up our son because she needed a break from him. He can be a handful, so I agreed and went over to get my boy. She didn't tell me where she was going or when she'd come back. Jacob, go on to your room now and play. Let me and these officers finish our conversation." He had been 9 when the officers came to question his father. Jacob knew better than to disagree with the old man, but he knew that his mother had made no such request. At the time, it had seemed that maybe Daddy had been confused, but Jacob found out later that his mother had divorced him and left town with someone else. She had never tried to see Jacob again, and his father telling the police a lie had always seemed a little weird to him. One look at his father's flinty eyes, however, had told him to do as he was told, and Jacob ran for the staircase in the living room. He was walking towards the doorway when he looked back towards his father, only to find that everything was gone. The kitchen was empty now, save for him. Lily reached for the handle of the door, turning the knob with trepidation. Was this another trick? Some new game for the house to tease her with? She had never given up hope that she would get out, but she thought she might have believed the house would keep her here forever anyway. Would they even find her body, she wondered? Would they know it was her if they did? The door swung open, and Lily was again assaulted by the smell of gardenias. She came down the steps, running over the walk, and found the car exactly where she'd left it. She almost saw Jacob sitting there, the phone still pressed against his ear, but when she stuck her head into the window, she found the car was empty, the keys still hanging in the ignition. Lily wasn't sure what to make of this, and as she sat in the passenger seat, her mind started trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She realized her marriage, her whole life, was full of these little lies. Her mind made up memories to protect her from reality, but the house showed her the truth. She remembered what her father had done to her mother and what her husband did to their son, and she felt disgust well up inside her. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered, tears coming unbidden. That still didn't explain why she had seen herself down in that cellar in such a state. As Lily thought about it, she realized she needed answers. She climbed over the driver's side and turned the key. The engine came to life, and Lily peeled the tires as she headed home. She wouldn't feel safe in that house until she checked the basement to be sure of what was there. Jacob would be angry if he came back to find the car missing, and if such a place existed in her home, she would likely find herself in there if he made it home. Jacob called out to Lily, hoping to find her safe and sound as he made it to the stairs. He could hear someone upstairs, and he kept calling for his wife as he ascended. He could hear someone crying in the bedroom to the right of him, and he was afraid that she had gotten hurt, or worse, that someone had hurt her. "Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay?" he called out. He slowly opened the door and peeked in to see himself holding their son. His wife cried as she watched him smothering their son. The baby had been crying for hours, and Jacob couldn't handle that high-pitched squeal anymore. He snapped, and it was something he regretted every day. He had tried to move from beneath the shadow of his father, especially after what he'd done to Lily, but it seemed that you never quite forgot the old ways, or the old lessons. He reached for Lily as she lay there crying, but as his hands passed through her, she turned to dust beneath his fingers. Everything melted away like dandelion fluff, and suddenly, the room was empty. As he backed out of the room, he heard sobbing from the bedroom across the hall again. Jacob's hands shook as he reached for the knob, but he had to find Lily and make her understand how sorry he was for their son's death. He peeked inside as the door creaked open and could see his own bedroom. Lily was crying as she spoke to someone on the phone. She was talking about, oh God, she was talking about his little secret. She had found the root cellar, the shame he had hidden for years, and now she knew everything. He charged in, trying to stop her, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, it all just melted away. Jacob's father had often said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Jacob supposed he'd been right. Lily had taken a lot of convincing, a lot of mental conditioning, but Stockholm Syndrome was an interesting thing. She never remembered how she came to be in Jacob's basement after he took her from her work one evening. She never questioned how they'd been married for 12 years when he had only snatched her 7 years ago. She had accepted that there were no pictures of their wedding because of the fire that had burned their apartment. She had accepted that their son had died of SIDS too, though he thought maybe that one had been harder to swallow than the rest. In many ways, it was like her mind created answers for questions before they were asked. By the sound of it, she had been doing that for most of her childhood. Jacob's childhood had been fraught, but Lily's had been something from a pulp novel. She'd been happy to forget, happy to cloud her own mind with misty memories and rose-colored tint. But this damn house had probably shown her all sorts of things that pulled the wool from her eyes. As Jacob sat in the empty room, he wondered if prison would be worse than living in this warped memory for the rest of his life. The whispers from the house told him that he'd never get to know. There would be no open door waiting for someone like Jacob. The house had a new toy, a new rat in its cage, and Jacob would never bask in the sun again. Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years, with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a "we'll think about it," and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far into the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. "So, can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer?" the boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. 1 minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand, when it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator, when it saw the all too intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness, when it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light, some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching, that just now came loose, and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and backways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I closed my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again.
Hey, you awake?
I pretended to be asleep, but she knew I wasn't. She jabbed me with her toe, and I put on some big fake snores as I played it up and hoped she'd forget what she wanted me to do. She was always doing this sort of thing, waking me up and asking me to do something in the middle of the night. With work less than 7 hours of blissful sleep away, though, I wanted to roll over and get back to it pretty badly. As the jabbing toe came again, I finally sighed and rolled over to face her. Not anymore, I guess. Good. Then you can take that trash out, right? I wrinkled my nose at her. The trash? Really? It's 1 a.m, Margaret. She wrinkled her own nose, knowing I only used her full name when I was put out with her. Yeah, and I've lain here and smelled that fish you put in the can for the last 3 hours. Please, for me. I rolled away from her and burrowed down into the covers. Why don't you do it if it's such a problem? Her voice was serious when she answered. You know I don't go out after dark. Remember, I told you that because your mom died. Yeah, I remember. Look, can't I just do it in the morning? It's really late, and the prodding toe became a foot that playfully rolled me out of bed. No, please, check on Emma while you're up, too. I sighed and walked up the hall to the kitchen, pausing to look into the nursery. Emma was snoring away happily from her crib, and I cracked the door and went into the kitchen. Maggie was right. The fish was ripe, and I lifted the shiny black bag out of the can and took it out the front door. I walked around the usual pitfalls that awaited me in the dark room. Toys, the footstool, clothes left for tomorrow's cleaning, and opened the front door to step outside. The air outside was thick, heavy with the smell of rain, and I just knew that it would take hours to get back to sleep after being buffeted by the aromatic wind. It wasn't until the front porch's worn boards greeted me that I realized the world looked a little strange. The walls were bent and wobbly, the colors slightly runny, and that's when I realized I'd forgotten my glasses. Now, I'm not blind by any stretch. I could navigate pretty well without them, but it was a pain to be out at night without them. I went down the porch steps, found the can, and dropped the bag in with a sudden clatter of cans, bottles, and other kitchen trash. The sound echoed across the still night like a cannon shot, and I was grateful that we didn't have any neighbors to bother. I felt for the banister rail and caught hold of the smooth wood as I mounted the stairs. That was when I heard a noise to my left. Maggie and I own land out in the country, and the woods that butt up against our property are rotten with coyotes, foxes, and the occasional raccoon or possum. This sound, however, was closer than I thought it should be, and as I looked up, I saw something gray moving out of the dog pen. Bosco, our husky lab mix, can usually be counted on to bark if he sees something weird, but as the shape glided towards the house, I remember wondering why he didn't make a sound. Watching the thing move filled me with a surge of terror and apprehension. Even without my glasses, its shape was wrong. It was long, not tall, thick, but not muscular, and it almost seemed to glide up the steps on the opposite end of the porch, as if floating. I was dazed. My senses turned up to 11, and the hairs on my body were standing on end as I stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, watching this thing open the front door before slamming it roughly behind it. That galvanized me. I was in motion before my lizard brain could think better of it. I sprinted up the stairs, through the screen door, and tripped hard against the patio furniture as I stumbled into the door. I pulled at the handle, but it was useless. Reaching to my side for keys, I found that I didn't have any, because I was absent pockets on my pajama pants. Ditto my cell phone, so my only course to warn Maggie seemed to be the old-fashioned way. I ran around the house, but found the bedroom window just out of reach. I found a cinder block, though, and sat it against the house's side as I tried to knock on the window and warn her. I raised my fist to hit the glass just as I heard the door to the bedroom open. I heard her sleepy voice say something about that didn't take too long, now did it? Heard the bed covers rustle as she sat up, and heard her scream as something made a sound between a cat and a flute. The cinder block smashed through the front door glass with an awful crash, and my bare feet sounded like cannon shots as they came slamming up the hallway on my way to the bedroom. I wrapped my hands around the doorknob, but before I could twist it, I heard the window break, and I knew I was too late. She waited for me inside, though, at least what was left of her. The police told me it looked like an animal attack. Her throat had been bitten out, her eyes had been removed. Her body looked like someone had tried to bite her as many times as possible. Bosco had been its first victim. His neck snapped with a single twist, and Emma and I seemed to be the only ones immune to its wrath. The paramedics took her away, wrapped in the black bag they used to spare the living, as my sleeping daughter and I stood on the very porch I had just watched the creature glide onto. I sold the house after that. I no longer felt safe within the walls of that home, and the memory of that creature was too fresh for me to ever feel safe there again. Emma and I moved into an apartment in the city. I found a place so full of noise and people that I doubted whatever it was could even live there. I still have trouble sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I dream about that abnormal shape that glided into my house and murdered my wife as she sat in her bed. Whether my Maggie knew it or not, she saved me that night. The message scrawled in her blood above the headboard was very clear on that, and me forgetting my glasses was probably the only reason I'm still alive. Maggie had always claimed that she saw her mother's killer. She told her therapist that it was a monster, something she had seen when she was a child, a demon, and when she was an adult, she had held firm to the idea that it wasn't human when she talked about it. Her mother had been on the porch with Maggie, looking out into the field behind their house, when she had suddenly put her little girl inside and locked the door. Maggie didn't see it at all, only some of it through the blurry window, but she must have seen something. That's why she had to die. The message was very clear. Scrawled in my wife's blood across the top of the headboard were 4 words that will haunt me until the day I die. Because she saw.